Yeah, we'll talk. I'll record. Yeah, so you said you had some notes ready for Jitterbug Perfume.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Brendan, for giving me Jitterbug Perfume as a gift and agreeing to talk about it. I really it meant a lot to me, and it made me read something I probably wouldn't have read. Right?
Yeah, yeah. I guess um, you do read a lot, and so it means a lot that it worked its way into your rotation. And
Yeah.
yeah, I know that a lot of the content was a bit bizarre and um, like you said, not something you would normally read, but I'm glad you did because I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in there, especially given when it was written, right? Tom Robbins wrote Jitterbug Perfume in the 80s, I believe, or was it
Yeah. Copyright 1984. Yeah.
1984? And so I feel like there's a lot of interesting kind of connections to like yoga and breath work and uh, just uh, consciousness that he kind of plays around with throughout the whole book. And yeah, I thought it was ahead of its time, and I thought the way it was written was it was very dense in the sense of there's a lot of passages with a lot of wordplay or a lot of expansive imagery, and so it kind of had the feeling of a book that you could read again and almost enjoy more with the way that he kind of paints the pictures in the book and puts words together.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're right. You realize how much reading, how many books I read that are really mundane or written very just no artistry to how they're written, and then this is just like a wow, just a either a psychedelic tapestry of words and images and everything he brings to bear.
Yeah,
Um,
and to be fair, there's a lot of it. There's a lot of topics, and we can kind of take them one by one. But in terms of the immortality piece, he's still alive and he's 90. So clearly, he might be implementing some of that immortality practice that is used throughout the book.
yeah. So yeah, well, I have to say that the practices seemed like a lot of what you do, Brendan, right?
Uh, yeah, I think so they break it down at one point in the book in terms of the elements, if I recall correctly, right?
Right.
That like um uh earth, wind, fire, and water. But yeah, definitely in terms of the breath work, which they mention a lot, uh, that's something that I have been trying to incorporate more and more ever since reading James Nestor's Breath, right? Like, I think, page 159, they reference the breath techniques, and then throughout the book. And then in terms of uh, I thought it was interesting, even like the baths, right? The water,
The
um,
hot water.
the hot
Uh,
water. Well, it wasn't necessarily the
cold, right?
it
Or
wasn't
did they?
necessarily the hot. It's the hot and the cold, right? So they take the hot water and then they, you know, allow themselves to cool down naturally, and but yeah, there was like a heat exposure, cold exposure kind of element to that piece.
The meditation element. There was a meditation.
Yep, meditation element. And actually, so I guess we'll jump right into that piece. There's the other pieces like hit the floral consciousness and some other stuff. But if we want to talk right about the immortality piece, I think it's an interesting commentary by Tom Robbins on yoga as it relates to the different schools. I think it's a slight critique of the more Patanjali, Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, in terms of um, the the void, or this kind of concept of just going to the Himalayas and um, meditating and living forever, but like never really interacting with society. I think the all of our character kind of represents the more tantric kind of concept of encompassing all levels of reality, and not, shying away from any part of life, right? I think the Olivar character kind of, he goes to Himalayas and he learns these techniques, but he uh, decides that he wants to experience life in its fullest. He says, "I don't want salvation. I want life, all of life, the miserable as well as the superb." Right. So,
Right.
um, I think, and then before that, it says the nothingness of the void is the Lama's final objective. So it's a really interesting kind of piece of commentary as it relates to yoga, because I think there's a lot of yoga that is void centric, or kind of uh, encourages that kind of removal from society. And so I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
if you look at Tom
I think
Robbins, I think yeah, his kind of opinion is more to kind of live life and engage with all of life.
so that's I think I have a quote that's like about that. There is plenty of misery in the world, all right, but there is ample pleasure as well. If a person forswears pleasure in order to avoid misery, what has he gained? How can you admire a human who consciously embraces the bland, the mediocre, the safe, rather than risk the suffering that disappointments can bring? If desire causes suffering, it may be because we do not desire wisely, or that we are inexpert at obtaining what we desire. Why not get better at fulfilling desire? I cannot believe that the most delicious things were placed here merely to test us, to tempt us, to make it the more difficult for us to achieve the grand prize, the safety of the void. To fashion of life such a petty game is unworthy of both men and gods. Is that
Hmm.
what you're thinking? Is that the thing you were
Yeah,
thinking?
yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's in the same ballpark as the quotes. But yeah, exactly that. What are your thoughts on what he has to say there?
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting that it, like I think when I was reading the book, it seemed like all these practices to achieve immortality were things that he was, advocating. But then I don't know, when I started reading other things afterwards, people are saying that Robbins is actually saying no, that life is precious and all these things that make life are more important than immortality, that you would rather give up immortality to truly live.
Yeah, yeah, and I think um, I could see how you thought that, because I kind of think that as well. He's kind of, it feels like in the book he's arguing that, I mean, because Alibar and Kudra, or what's her name?
Yeah.
Something like that. They achieve immortality while still living like the life of a gypsy, and engaging in, kind of things that a typical monk would deem as, counter to that um, hermit lifestyle, right? Like they're
Right.
engaging in sexual practices, and they're engaging in binge eating, and just kind of excess that would you would assume would not grant them the same benefits that the um, llamas get, but they do because they still maintain those daily practices. But it's kind of this balance of, I think he's arguing that you need some sort of discipline or principle in life in order to uh, live forever, but that if that is your primary, if that supersedes your enjoyment of life, then you're wasting your life, even if it lasts forever.
Yeah. 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 I think you're right. That is what he's saying. Yeah.
So
I did think though that the practices back in 1984, you can't imagine the popularity of those kind of practices today, right? Like I think in 1984, those would have seemed pretty kind of far out, or not the mainstream that they are now.
yeah, they're it's almost across the board. Like you compare it with a Huberman podcast, for instance, and the yeah the he's always talking about heat exposure and cold exposure and um, in terms of uh, eating, right? Like I think that was even that was something that people, they are all, it's like the Atkins diet. You got to avoid carbs. You got to really what they said, what he says there is very true. Like the amount you have is so much more important than what you eat. That even the blue zones, right? The big concept behind the blue zones is that like the 80% full kind of concept, right? You eat to 80% full and then you finish, right? And I think even in the book, he kind of references that concept of like, you can kind of eat whatever, but as long as you don't have too much. So I agree. I thought he clearly, there's a lot of research that kind of is interwoven within the book, which I really appreciate. Because it has a story and it has, which I thought was an interesting story, and it has a um uh kind of progression, but then it has a lot of interesting uh information interwoven.
Yeah. Well, so can I mean, that makes me think about how the book was structured with going back in time and the different
Mm,
characters and the way all that was. Now I'm somewhat, I want to be fully transparent with you, Brendan. I used Chat GPT and I asked the chatbot, the AI, to generate 5 questions about Jitterbug perfume and then answer it for me, and
haha,
each of them in 1 to 2 paragraphs.
that's hilarious.
I feel like you would be very proud of me for doing it, because
That's
I'm
awesome.
really trying to use the AI, see how I could use it. But I also feel like Tom Robbins would be really proud of me for using it. But one of the questions was that the book jumps back and forth between different time periods and storylines. How does this affect the pacing of the book? And what do you think is the purpose behind this structure? Which I really like that question, because I think it gets at what you're talking about, the people, the development of the characters, and how it fits up in the end. Um, I don't know. I feel like I really enjoyed that there was the back and forth, but there was enough structure to it that, like, he did everybody in the same order each time, right?
Yeah.
So you could wrap your head around, okay, now I'm back in New Orleans. Okay, now I'm, like, so you could wrap your head around it. And then when I really liked how all the characters came together in the end and everything.
Yeah, it's a good point. Like it it had a structure. It was very similar to exactly what I talked about in terms of what it feels like Tom Robbins' view on life is like you need discipline and structure, but then within those confines, you try to have as much fun as possible. And it feels like he did the kind of same thing. He kind of had these artificial constraints of okay, well, I'm gonna tell the story this way with this kind of structure, but then within that structure, I'm gonna go all over the place and say some crazy stuff and divulge and break the fourth wall randomly and put in a bunch of puns. But I did really like how he structured it, and I agree. I thought it was really cool how everyone came together. I'm curious, what were if you had to rank the 4 storylines or which ones you enjoyed the most, right? Because you had also the Olibar Kudra, right? Which they exist.
Right.
They always started the chapter, and
Right.
then it was uh, New Orleans or it was Seattle. Did it go Seattle, New Orleans, Paris? Right. uh, that structure, or kind of something like that. Which storylines did you enjoy the most?
That's a good question. So I have Seattle, Paris. So when mine started, actually, now that I look at how it starts with like a preamble about beats, and then it goes Seattle, Paris. But then it starts part one, the hair and the bean, and that starts with Alabar, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I kind of like the New Orleans one, I have to say,
Mm.
but um did you like Alabar and Kudra better?
To me, that was like 10 times better than all the rest of them.
Yeah, that was
uh,
where most of it happened. Most of the crazy happened, right?
yeah, yeah, that was, I think, the most fantastical with the elements of yoga and Pan. I thought Pan was a really interesting person. I thought it was really interesting. I think the one thing with this book, if someone were to critique it from just reading once, it's just like he had so many themes. It was hard to keep track of them all. But obviously within the Olivar one, the other interesting thing was like Pan and then rising Christianity and the rising of like Descartes and like all these kind of like uh, the the traditional Western kind of society and Western belief systems basically like destroyed Pan slowly over
Right.
time. I
Right.
thought that was really interesting. Uh, I thought, yeah, he would obviously have a bunch of um, uh, things like he was at Descartes' funeral and he paraphrased his uh, his famous dictum, "I stink, therefore I am." Right? The Pan.
Yeah,
I thought the
yeah,
I thought
yeah,
the
yeah.
the Pan character, in addition to like the concept of perfume and the concept of um, floral consciousness versus mammalian consciousness versus reptilian consciousness. I thought it was a really interesting. So all that felt like it was happening inside of the Oliver story. I will say what I liked about the other three. My favorite part of the Seattle story was the Danny Wiggum or Wigman or
The
whatever his
last
name was.
laugh thing.
That
Yeah,
guy, the last laugh guy, which
yeah.
I made notes like they kept because I read How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, right, which catalogs the history of like Timothy Leary and psychedelics and stuff like that. And I remember finding a certain quote where it was like he dropped it said that Danny Wig, on page 243, brilliant young anthropologist who left his native Dublin to teach at Harvard, where he experimented with mind-altering chemicals beyond the call of academic duty. And then I learned after kind of researching it that I think Tom Robbins had a relationship with Timothy Leary, and then this character is based on Timothy Leary, the
It sure seems like it was. Yeah.
right.
Did
So
you confirm that somewhere that that
yeah, I
he really
confirmed
was?
that. I
Oh,
confirmed it.
okay.
Yeah. So it's definitely confirmed. But when you have things like name dropping Harvard, right, it kind of it becomes really clear that that was the case. But I thought he was an interesting character. And then in terms of the New Orleans storyline, honestly, that I just didn't. Nothing about that storyline excited me too much, um, to be honest. And then, but it was necessary. It was necessary, and I think it
I was
was.
pulling for them to find it before the French people found it. I guess maybe, but maybe I didn't know at the time that the one was a spy for the French guy. But I don't know why. But that's why I think I was pulling for them.
Yeah, that's fair. And yeah, the French guys were pretty annoying, except for the I did find that the what was it, Bunny or what's his name? I thought his speech on he obviously gave the speech on the consciousness, and then the speech on just like the artistry of perfume, and almost it felt like chef's table for perfume, where you kind of had someone describing uh, that process as an art form, and I thought I enjoyed that. So yeah, I was
Oh, that's an
curious.
interesting thing. I hadn't thought of it that way. I think actually that's a really good way to think of that speech, right? I hadn't thought of it like you're kind of a select group, right? A group of people who are
Experts in this field, right?
Yep, yeah, for sure. And it felt like he felt like um, Grant Achaz from Alinea trying to make perfumes, right?
Yeah.
That's who he reminded me of, it's like just like trying to really change the game, and do it in an authentic way. Um, so just to let you know, it's the reason this is a 40-minute podcast is because I have the 40-minute Zoom, and I think we wasted a little bit of time at the front end. So we've only got 8 minutes left.
Oh my goodness. Wow. I was thinking there's no way we'll talk about this for 40 minutes.
That's the thing. This is my fault. This is end up being the 30-minute podcast, this episode, I think. But yeah, I wanted to leave the floor to you. That it sounds like you had more things that you wanted to bring up, either from ChatGPT or from your own stuff.
Well, a couple of things from my own. One, and I think we talked about this before, was I love little asides or little insights into life that and they're everywhere. Like you said, he had so many themes. But remember that one about the travel quote? I love that travel, but the serendipity or the unplanned adventure is what really makes it travel, right? It's if all you do is do exactly what expect to do and travel exactly where you expect to be, like you're not really experiencing the adventure part of it. But then little things like that, really, I love those as I read them.
Yeah.
um
And there were a lot of like that, right?
So yeah,
Um,
so many quotes like that, like the stink, therefore I am one, or I took some notes on some, but yeah, like kind of life lesson stuff, or um, just little nuggets of wisdom interspersed
yeah,
throughout.
everywhere. Like on page 145, music's ability to transport us. So like how you can travel just through the experience of music and dancing and feeling that. Yeah, I don't know. There were a lot of things like that. Um, but the other thing that I thought, and you brought it up with the pan line and the Christianity, but that the whole concept that gods do not limit men, that we limit ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Page 147, but just this whole concept that we put these limits on ourselves and that we need to lift it. I think part of what he provides as examples are places where, okay, Alabar is supposed to be, I mean, his culture is, when you are aging as the king, you get killed, but he rejects that norm of his culture, right? And that
Yep.
allows him to escape that place and go somewhere far beyond anything like he would have imagined, right? And same thing with, isn't it Kudra? Isn't she supposed to kill herself with her husband? She runs away
Yep.
instead, or yeah.
Yep.
Uh,
Yep.
and those are extreme cultural expectations, but we all have cultural expectations every day that probably limit what we consider feasible or practical or things that we should do, right? Whereas if we could free ourselves from those cultural expectations or limits or self-imposed limits, there's so much more that we're capable of or could do or achieve, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, that's a really, yeah, great way to put it, in terms of, I think, what he kind of and even as you apply it to the limits of even the holy like the lamas or all that I think people kind of create rules for themselves and then live with inside them. And then as you said for the travel, it's the same thing, kind of create rules for yourself and then live inside them, and in that sense kind of not grow. Maybe it allows you some safety or some you protect yourself in a sense, but you don't have that potential to grow and to expand. And so I thought that was really interesting. I thought there was a lot of that of like you said, the gods, like the Pan and all these kind of people being like critical of how humans tend to live, right?
Right.
And then just kind of seeing that over time. I will say in terms of the actual content of the book, there's it's a lot of vulgar imagery and frankness, and I think that's important to state about the book, right? That I'm curious how you felt reading it. There's a lot of um, I would
Yeah,
say
which is
cheesy.
probably what, I mean, it took me until I'm 63 to read it. That's probably what turned me off in my 20s, because I would not have liked that in my 20s. Probably I was a more, mm, probably more constrained by all the my view of what was right or wrong or whatever. That I always struggled to read him when I was younger, and that might be part of the reason why. Like,
Yeah,
now it just strikes me as it's kind of like shock jock value. Like some of that imagery is just makes its point by being so shocking, right?
mm. Yeah. What he reminded me of, the person he reminded me of with that was kind of David Lynch. When I watched David Lynch's movies, of just
Okay.
honestly, I kind of had a similarity in terms of how I kind of um, view their art, where they're just so true to it felt like reading this, that they're just so true to their art that they're not going to do it any other way than what they set, they kind of have it in their head, even if it's a bit off-putting. Like when you watch a
Yeah.
David Lynch movie, or even Twin Peaks or anything, there's a lot of scenes where you're just like, what? Or like, that's a little bit too much or whatever. But I think it's more of a byproduct, like you said, or my opinion is, I think it's just him. He's trying to be true to, it's an authenticity thing. He wants to say it the way it is in his head, right? Or even if it's a bit off-putting. And then I think his kind of angle is he wants it to be funny or a bit not taking too seriously the art form or the kind of content, and so we'll just put in a bunch of um, frank phrases
Yeah.
throughout it. But
Maybe it keeps it from being pretentious. You're saying authentic, but maybe like if he said he could make those same points in a way that would be, you know, I don't know, more socially palatable, but he's not, right?
yep, yeah, I think um, uh, yeah, it's hard to know. It sometimes it would make me cringe. A lot of things you would say would make me cringe, just in not just the vulgar stuff, but just like too much, right? But